thought Ten Hag at the beginning of the season lacked the lustre. Cannot discount Manchester United from a conversation of winning this league. We're halfway through it. If it continues as it is, obviously, you don't need Pythagoras to tell you that Arsenal are going to win the league. But stranger things have happened, and such is the momentum with Manchester United. This is One-to-One with Simon Jordan. Don't forget to keep doing that social media tosh of liking and subscribing. And of course, leaving your brilliant questions in the comment section below. But let's get on with this week's show. Chelsea handing out 7 or 8 year contracts for players is part of the structured approach, Kane, who asked the question in terms of why would they do it? If you're going to spend £88 million or £70 million guaranteed and £10 million on extras and a whole raft of other things on a player that's played 49 games, you're going to want to capitalise that player over the longest period of time. And what that means is every year, if that player was on a 4-year contract and they paid 80 million quid for him, every year they'd be losing 20 million pounds of his value. If they put him on an 8-year contract, every year they're losing 10 million pounds of his value. So there's two things behind that. There's economic thinking about how they can make sure that they don't start breaching things like financial fair play. There's solid financial thinking, because it's the same thing, to make sure that your assets depreciate over the longest period of time. There's security of tenure, because the player's only 22 years of age, and if he is what they think he is, then they don't have any challenges in terms of him being able to be lured away by the football clubs, albeit there are very few football clubs that can lure a player away from Chelsea financially. They can lure them away with their lustre, like Real Madrid did with Eden Hazard. How'd that work out? But I think there's more sense to it. Now, of course, the flip side of the argument is that people will say, well, where's the incentive? Where does the player have to apply himself? Where does the player have to be kept on his toes? Well, look, I suspect during the confines of this contract there'll be caveats like increases based upon performance. So there'll always be this motivation for him to kick on to the next level. And of course, players in this day and age, whether they're on 200 grand a week or 300 grand a week, are as good as the manager that motivates them. So whilst it does look slightly strange because the tried and trusted methodology of 3-year contracts or 4-year contracts is being completely superseded by this, this is based upon Bowley looking at it as a businessman, saying, why would I depreciate a player over 4 years when I can depreciate him over 8? And if I want to sell him, well, then I'll sell him anyway, and it'll take care of itself. So I think there's more sense than ludicrousy to it. Look, every football club goes for a period where it's not in ascendancy. Now, of course, Liverpool and FSG is a marriage that's been made most of the time in heaven. There's been a few slip-ups and a few faux pas with them doing certain things that Liverpool fans haven't agreed with. Klopp has had a ride for the first 2.5 years where he didn't win anything and got away with this $64 million smile that he has. And now has produced a wonderful side that last year was on the cusp of winning 4, doing the quadruple. The idea that FSG have let Klopp down, I'm not sure, because if Klopp hasn't got the currency to leverage money out of Liverpool when he needs it for key component parts like central midfield, Graeme Souness talks about it on shows that we've done with him, about the necessity for Liverpool to have more legs in the middle of the park, but I didn't hear Graeme or anyone saying that at the beginning of the season. That's become evident as it's been seen that they haven't had sufficient amount of creativity and legs to be able to play the way Klopp has wanted them to play. He has to take responsibility for that. Klopp has to take responsibility for that. There's no indication that FSG have pulled up the drawbridge financially. There's only an indication that Klopp either hasn't identified the concern, hasn't prioritised it, because they went out and spent £80 million on the centre forward and Darwin Núñez, or it's become something that they've overlooked. Now, I don't think it should be anybody looking at anybody else with blame attribution. Blame attribution doesn't resolve anything. Identifying the problem and resolving it is what a good manager does. Changing the dressing room, accepting that certain players may need to be moved on or coming to the end of their tenure. Now, I'm not suggesting Klopp's lost his touch, but Liverpool are not in a good vein of form. They, like anyone else, have a raft of injuries, but that's the same for most of the teams, with the exception, I suspect, of the top sides, which is where Liverpool should be. You know, the injury crises aren't so deep, besides at Chelsea. Look, I think this is a moment in time that Klopp's got to get a hold of it. The argument that Klopp runs in cycles and all of a sudden those cycles burn out teams, well, he's an elite manager, and part of being an elite manager is that you have to regenerate. If they sign someone like Jude Bellingham, that will regenerate Liverpool in a significant way. But I don't think it's about blame attribution. I don't think it's about FSG letting anybody down. I think Liverpool, irrespective of whether they're competing with Arsenal, Manchester City, and Newcastle, surprisingly at this moment in time, should have enough about them to be getting far better results than some of the games that they've gotten beaten in. Now, of course, that suggests that the other sides are there to be beaten, and they're not. The Premier League is a very competitive place. But if you look at some of the results that Liverpool have not achieved and some of the performances they've put in, that's got nothing to do, it's got bugger all to do with FSG. Even Klopp and even a football manager in their most obtuse that will be in a situation where success is all theirs and failure is shared, will accept that performance against Brighton, and Klopp has done. He's turned around and said it's the worst performance he's put in, or the team has put in, since he's been Liverpool manager. Now that might be hyperbole, but it certainly ain't FSG. Can United win the title? Yes, they can win the title. Will they win a title? I doubt it. What they are is they're in a good run of form. They've had a very good run of games prior to beating Manchester City that have been not gimmies, because there's no game in the Premier League that's a gimme, but they've had a decent run of opposition that you would have expected. Even the slightly dysfunctional Manchester United that they have been would have been able to achieve results in, and thus they did. Now, of course, that's been overlaid now by their performance against Manchester City. A strange Manchester City at this moment in time. Strange Manchester City when you've got players like Gundogan talking out about things aren't right. Ironically, he wasn't picked for this particular game. But you have to give credit where credit's due. You know, I've made observations about Ten Hag that have been inflated up to something more than I was actually saying. I thought Ten Hag at the beginning of the season lacked the lustre from how he held himself to the manner in which he presented himself, and I characterised that in his suit don't even fit him, and people have taken that to the ridiculous. It was because I was looking at the reality of a leadership, and he didn't look like he was coming out across the way I felt that a Manchester United manager that was going to sweep this particular environment clean should have done. But now he has. The clearing of the decks with Ronaldo, whether he could and should have done that is a different discussion. The language coming out of him in terms of his expectations of his players, the performance on the pitch is far more compelling. And when you win games like Manchester City, even if you aren't against Manchester City, even if you aren't as good as those sides, you build inherent belief. And as you can see from football clubs like Newcastle, who aren't going pound for pound in player value with teams that are in the division, albeit they've spent a fair amount of money, confidence and momentum are significant things. Now, can that translate into a title? In this division, where you're seeing Chelsea struggling under a new manager, the subject matter we talked about a moment ago, Liverpool not finding their feet, Tottenham seeming to be taking one step back to take two steps forwards, Arsenal dominating the league now and coming out in a way without ultimately certain players that you would have expected them to be at the front of the queue, like Jesus, all makes it a very strange Premier League. You've got Fulham, you know, in 6th or 7th spots. You've got teams like Brentford and Brighton that are playing and beating the biggest opposition. So that means whether this is a World Cup Premier League that's affecting the landscape, or there's a bridging of the gap between the top sides, or a slight decline in some of the top sides, that's concertining it all together, it does mean you cannot discount Manchester United from a conversation of winning this league. We're halfway through it. If it continues as it is, obviously, you don't need Pythagoras to tell you that Arsenal are going to win the league. But stranger things have happened, and such is the momentum with Manchester United. They're in a cup semi-final. If they carry themselves through that and win that, who would suggest that in this particular season that Man United can't be given a fair chance? I think that they are not quite there. I think they're on a far more compelling journey than they've been recently. So the answer is, can they win it? Yes. Will they win it? I don't think so. This argument of going on tour or the 39th game being played around the world, and of course the Spanish Super Cup being played in Saudi, there's a very different component, a very different dynamic between the Premier League and its European counterparts. They don't get anywhere near, and I mean nowhere near, the revenues that the English Premier League gets. So the idea that we need to go on tour and take our assets, like our cups, and play them somewhere else, I'm not sure will find itself on fertile ground. If you close your eyes and think hard and name all the big cups in European leagues, you'll struggle. You'll look at the Copa del Rey and you might think of a couple of other leagues, but you'll always remember the FA Cup. So I'm not entirely sure why there would be any appetite, financial or literal, to take the heritage of a cup and play it in Saudi for the benefit of Middle Eastern opportunities. Now, that being said, money is money, and if the idea behind playing a tournament that culminates in the Middle East generates significant amounts of revenue, then you'd never discount it. I don't see it, and I don't see the necessity. This argument keeps on being made to take it around, take it on tour, take it out to the far-flung corners of the earth to be able to broaden the range and reach of the Premier League or the various component parts of English football. Cobblers, it's an enormously watched product. It's got more eyes on the prize than any league in the world, and it's continuing to grow, and that comes from broadcast deals. It comes from the constant renegotiation and re-evaluation of what broadcast deals look like around the world. So with that in mind, I don't see it. I don't think we need to fall into the same space and place that some of the European counterparts fall into, like La Liga, because they can't keep up with the economic powerhouse that is the Premier League. And I think there's an element of devaluing it. Yeah, we can take the NFL, which is the most valuable sports franchises right now, and take them around the world because it's a game that's particularly centred in North America. So they're trying to broaden the horizons. Football isn't centred in Europe. Football is centred around the globe, as we've seen in the World Cup, and as we see the emergence of African countries and Arab nations in football, you're going to see the demand for more domestic football to be broadcast. So no, I don't see it. I don't want it. I don't see it. I don't think it's necessary, and I'd be surprised if it happens. It's always difficult for me as a former Crystal Palace owner to feign or show any interest in what's happening at Brighton. I like Tony Bloom, and I know his brother Darren, so I'm always interested to hear about their progress with a slightly tongue-in-cheek mentality. I think De Zerbi's inherited a very decent side. I think Trossard's a very good player, and I think it's disappointing that players behave in a certain way. You know, it looks like there've been altercations not just with the manager but with other players. The difficulty in football is it all becomes hyped up into something, and if you have problems in a workplace, in a normal commercial workplace, what someone gets is they get suspended or they get disciplined. In football, the way you do that is you send them off to train somewhere else and keep them away from everybody else, and that becomes this blown up set of consequences. De Zerbi's side are a good side. They're a good side built on solid foundations by Graham Potter. You know, again, using Graeme Souness as an example, Souness was very critical of the appointment of De Zerbi and looked at his background, how many clubs he's had and what that's subsequently meant. But he's landed in the Premier League with Brighton, who tend, more often than not in recent times, to do their due diligence properly. So I think he's got the chops to be the Brighton manager. Now that translates on to how does he handle a player? How do you handle modern day footballers? You let them get away with what they want, you let them do what they want, you let them say what they want, or you have the courage of your convictions to tell them and the group behind them that it's kind of one sheriff in town, and that sheriff is the manager. Now, if that's the case, then I'm with De Zerbi for marginalising the player, putting the player in his position and going on and smashing Liverpool 3-0 without him, because that tells you how valuable the player is in the short term. Of course, in the longer term, he's a very good player, and there has to be a resolution to this problem. And of course, in the middle of it is an agent with his particular brand of solution, which is stirring it up and causing more division because ultimately he's going to make some money with a move in hand. I think De Zerbi has got a football team which is functioning, and if he's got to lose Trossard, then he loses him on Brighton's terms. And if that means in the meantime he's got to make sure that the player understands his place on the food chain, then I make the manager right. I think he tried to address the issue in a pre-match interview on Saturday with he's got broken English, so you're not going to get exactly what he means, but I don't think the manager has any great remorse about how the players are being handled by him in terms of, he talked about the nature of the agent and he talked about the ability of the player, but he's more focused on the here and now. Look, it just shows you, doesn't it? Every football club has these challenges, and De Zerbi's team are winning, and that's the component that makes more sense than worrying about the individual player. So I'm more inclined to back the manager, but then again I would be, because my mentality is the manager would be my champion as an owner. That's it for this week's edition of One to One with Simon Jordan. Don't forget to let me know your views on Klopp, FSG and the decline of Liverpool. The idea that we need to play games abroad like the Spanish do. And player disputes, Trossard at Brighton being the case in point. Keep leaving your questions in the comment section below. Keep liking and subscribing, and I'll see you next week.